The gunshot that rang through the Reading saloon that August afternoon in 1878 wasn't meant to kill, but the words that followed were deadlier than any bullet. Natalie Vernon stood frozen near the bar, her cheeks burning crimson as Marcus Holloway's drunken laughter echoed off the wooden walls, his crude suggestions about what she might do to earn extra money hanging in the air like smoke. Every pair of eyes in the establishment turned toward her, watching to see if the schoolteacher would crumble under the weight of public humiliation. She didn't crumble. Something hardened in her spine, something forged from years of fighting for respect in a town that saw women as decoration or property. "Take that back," she said, her voice cutting through the sudden silence. Marcus sneered, swaying slightly as he leaned against the poker table. "Or what, schoolmarm? You going to give me detention?" "I challenge you to a duel," Natalie said, the words leaving her mouth before her mind could catch up. "Tomorrow at dawn. You will apologize, or you will face me." The saloon erupted into chaos. Men laughed. Others shouted protests. Some looked at her like she'd lost her senses. Marcus's face went from amused to incredulous. "You can't be serious." "Deadly serious." Her hands trembled, but her voice didn't. "You have insulted my honor in front of witnesses. By the code you men claim to live by, I have every right to demand satisfaction." "The hell you do," Marcus spat. "I'm not shooting a woman." "Then you're a coward as well as a liar." That did it. Marcus's face turned purple with rage. "Fine. Dawn tomorrow, the clearing by Miller's Creek. Don't expect me to aim wide just because you're wearing skirts." Natalie nodded once sharply, then turned and walked out of the saloon with her head high, even though her knees felt like water. She made it 3 steps into the dusty California street before the reality of what she'd done crashed over her. She'd never fired a gun in her life. She was going to die tomorrow, but at least she'd die with her dignity intact. That was either the bravest or the most foolish thing I've ever seen. She spun around to find a tall cowboy leaning against the saloon's porch post, his dark hair shadowed by his hat, his weathered face unreadable. She recognized him vaguely as Dalton Ingram, one of the ranch hands from the cattle operation north of town. He'd been sitting quietly in the corner during the whole spectacle. "I don't need commentary," she said tightly. "What you need is a miracle, or at least shooting lessons." He pushed off the post and stepped closer. "Marcus Holloway might be a drunk and a fool, but he can shoot. He won 2 quick draw competitions last year." Natalie's stomach dropped, but she lifted her chin. "Then I suppose I should make peace with my maker tonight." Dalton studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his gray eyes. "Or you could let me teach you. I've got 18 hours to turn you into someone who can at least hold a gun without shooting herself in the foot." "Why would you help me?" "Because what he said to you was wrong. Because you stood up for yourself when most people would have just taken it. Because—" He paused, a slight smile touching his lips. "I'm curious to see if that fire in you burns hot enough to actually pull this off." Natalie wanted to refuse on principle. She'd spent her whole life proving she didn't need anyone's help, especially not a man's. But pride was one thing, stupidity was another. "Fine. But I won't owe you anything for this." "Wouldn't dream of asking." He tipped his hat. "Meet me at my place, the old Henderson cabin about 2 miles north, in an hour. Bring your determination and whatever gun you can get your hands on." He walked away before she could respond, leaving her standing in the street wondering if she'd just made her second terrible decision of the day or her first smart one. The cabin was smaller than she expected, neat and spare in that way of men who lived alone and kept things simple. Dalton was waiting outside, a collection of guns laid out on a makeshift table made from an old door and 2 sawhorses. "Can you shoot at all?" he asked without preamble. "I've watched people shoot," Natalie offered weakly. He closed his eyes briefly. "Lord help us. All right, pick one that feels comfortable in your hand." She examined the weapons nervously, finally selecting a smaller revolver that didn't feel quite so much like holding a cannon. Dalton stepped behind her, his hands carefully adjusting her grip, his voice patient as he explained about stance and sight lines and breathing. His presence was warm and solid, and despite the circumstances, she found herself acutely aware of how close he was standing. "Why are you really helping me?" she asked after her fifth practice shot at a line of bottles he'd set up. She'd missed all five. "I told you." "You told me a partial truth. There's more." He was quiet for a moment, reloading the revolver. "My sister. She was talked about the way Marcus talked about you, except she didn't have your courage. She just took it until she stopped talking altogether. Eventually, she married the first man who'd have her just to escape the gossip, and he was worse than the talk ever was." His jaw tightened. "She's trapped now in Denver with a man who treats her like property. Maybe if someone had stood beside her the way you stood up for yourself, things would be different." Natalie's throat tightened. "I'm sorry." "Don't be sorry. Just shoot straight." He positioned her again, this time standing even closer, his arms bracketing hers as he guided the gun up. "Focus. See the target. Breathe out slow, then squeeze. Don't pull." This time when she fired, a bottle exploded in a shower of glass. She gasped, spinning to face him with shock and delight written across her face. He was grinning, genuine and warm, and something flipped in her chest. "Again," he said. They worked until the sun began to set, until her arms ached and her ears rang despite the cotton he'd given her to stuff in them. She was hitting the targets more often than not now, though she knew that shooting at stationary bottles was different from facing down a man who wanted to kill her. As darkness gathered, Dalton finally called a halt. "That's enough for tonight. You need rest before tomorrow." Natalie set down the gun, her hands grimy with powder residue. "I'm terrified," she admitted quietly. "You should be. Fear keeps you sharp." He moved to start packing up the weapons. "But I've seen something in you today. You're a fighter, Miss Vernon. You don't give up." "Natalie, if we're going to spend the night preparing for my potential death, you should call me Natalie." "Dalton," he offered in return, though she already knew. "And you're not going to die." "You can't promise that." "No," he agreed, "but I can promise you won't face it alone." He paused, then added quietly, "When you stand across from him tomorrow, I'll be standing beside you." Something in the way he said it made her breath catch. "The town will talk." "Let them talk. I'm not much for other people's opinions anyway." They stood in the gathering dusk, the California hills rolling golden around them, and Natalie realized that in the space of a few hours this quiet cowboy had become more real to her than people she'd known for years. There was something honest in him, something steady that she'd never encountered before. "I should get back to town," she said reluctantly. "I'll ride with you. It's not safe alone in the dark." "I've ridden alone before." "I know. But tonight you don't have to." The ride back was quiet, comfortable in a way that surprised her. At the edge of town, Dalton stopped. "Get some sleep if you can. I'll meet you at Miller's Creek an hour before dawn. We'll practice a bit more, settle your nerves." "Dalton?" She hesitated, then forged ahead. "Thank you. Whatever happens tomorrow, thank you for this." He looked at her for a long moment, something unreadable in his expression. "Don't thank me yet. Thank me when this is over, and you're still standing." Sleep didn't come easily that night. Natalie lay in her small room above the general store where she boarded, listening to the sounds of Redding settling into night. She'd come to California 3 years ago, fresh from a teaching college in Boston, full of idealistic notions about educating the frontier. The reality had been harder and lonelier than she'd imagined. The town had never quite accepted her. This Eastern woman with her books and her opinions. She'd made a place for herself through sheer stubborn determination, but she'd never had anyone really stand beside her. Until today. She thought about Dalton, about the patience in his hands as he'd taught her, about the story of his sister that still clearly pained him. There was a goodness in him that had nothing to do with manners or propriety and everything to do with character. In a single afternoon, he'd shown her more respect than most of Reading had in 3 years. When she finally slept, she dreamed of gray eyes and steady hands. The world was still dark when she rose, dressing in her simplest clothes. No corset today, nothing that would restrict her movement or breathing. She plaited her dark hair into a single practical braid and stared at herself in the small mirror. The face looking back was pale, but determined. Whatever happened in the next few hours would define the rest of her life, however long that might be. Dalton was already at Miller's Creek when she arrived, a lantern casting long shadows across the clearing. He had coffee brewing over a small fire and handed her a cup without a word. The warmth was welcome in the pre-dawn chill. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Like I'm about to walk into my own execution." "Good, that's realistic." He set down his own cup. "Let's run through it again." They practiced as the sky began to lighten, gray giving way to pale pink and gold. Her hands were steadier today, her shots more confident. Dalton watched her with an intensity that was both unnerving and oddly comforting. "Remember," he said as the sun began to break over the eastern hills, "Marcus will try to rattle you with words. Don't listen. Focus on what you need to do. Count your paces, turn, aim center mass, and shoot. Don't hesitate, don't second guess." "You make it sound simple." "It's not simple at all. It's the hardest thing you'll ever do." He reached out and squeezed her shoulder briefly. "But you can do it." The sound of horses and voices drifted across the morning air. They were coming. Natalie's heart began to hammer against her ribs. Dalton doused the fire and moved to stand beside her as a group of men rode into the clearing. Marcus was at the front, looking considerably more sober than yesterday, but no less hostile. Behind him were his friends, and behind them, to Natalie's surprise, was half the town. Word had spread. Of course it had. The town doctor, old Samuel Chen, who'd emigrated from China 20 years ago and was the closest thing Reading had to an authority, dismounted and approached them. "Miss Vernon, Mr. Holloway, this is highly irregular." "She challenged me," Marcus said. "I accepted. It's legal." Dr. Chen looked pained. "Legal, perhaps, but hardly advisable. Miss Vernon, you can still withdraw the challenge." "She won't," Dalton said quietly. "And who are you?" Marcus demanded, seeming to notice Dalton for the first time. "Dalton Ingram." "This isn't your fight, Ingram." Dalton's expression didn't change. "When she's done with you, I'm next." The clearing went dead silent. Natalie's head whipped around to stare at Dalton. His gray eyes met hers for just a moment, and she saw the message there. He wouldn't let her stand alone. If by some miracle she survived this, he was declaring publicly that anyone who came after her would have to go through him first. Marcus's face twisted with anger. "You're both crazy." "Maybe," Dalton agreed mildly, "but the lady asked for a duel and she's going to get one. So let's get on with it." Dr. Chen sighed deeply and began explaining the rules. 10 paces, turn on his mark, fire when ready. He would attempt to treat whoever was injured, but he made both parties acknowledge that death was a likely outcome. Natalie's mouth was dry as desert sand. Marcus took his position on one end of the clearing. Natalie walked to her mark, the revolver heavy in her hand. Dalton's voice was low in her ear as he walked her to the position. "You've got this. Breathe, aim, shoot. I believe in you." Then he stepped back, standing at the edge of the clearing where she could see him. His presence was an anchor. "Back to back," Dr. Chen called. Natalie turned, and suddenly Marcus was right there, his back against hers. She could feel him breathing, feel the tension in his body. This was real. This was happening. "Begin pacing." She stepped forward, counting in her head. 1, 2, 3. The world had narrowed to the sound of her heartbeat and the feeling of ground beneath her feet. 4, 5, 6. Dalton's face in her mind, steady and sure. 7, 8, 9. 10, turn! She spun, her hand coming up with the gun, and time seemed to slow. Marcus was turning too, his weapon already rising. She could see his face, see the determination there, see the exact moment he realized she wasn't hesitating. Dalton's voice in her memory. Center mass, don't think. Just shoot. 2 shots cracked across the morning, so close together they were almost one sound. Something burned across Natalie's upper arm, bright and sharp. She stumbled but stayed upright, the gun still in her hand, her arm still extended. Across the clearing, Marcus was down on one knee, his left hand clutching his right shoulder, blood seeping between his fingers. His gun lay in the dust 3 feet away. The clearing erupted into chaos. Dr. Chen was running toward Marcus. Several men were shouting. And Dalton was there, his hands on her shoulders, his eyes searching her face. Are you hit? My arm just grazed, I think. The adrenaline was making her shake, making the world swim. Is he? Shoulder. He'll live. Dalton's hands moved to her arm, carefully pushing up the torn sleeve. You're right, just a graze. Natalie, you did it. You stood your ground and you won. The shaking got worse. She'd shot a man. She'd actually shot Marcus Holloway. He could have died. She could have died. The gun slipped from her fingers and Dalton caught it, then caught her as her knees buckled. I've got you, he murmured. You're all right, it's over. Dr. Chen appeared, his face stern. Let me see that arm, Miss Vernon. She let him clean and bandage the wound in a daze, aware of the crowd gathering, of the whispers running through the assembled townspeople. Marcus was being tended to by one of his friends, his face gray with pain and what might have been shock. When the doctor finished with Natalie, he turned to address the crowd. The duel is concluded. Both parties are injured but will recover. Miss Vernon, Mr. Holloway, this matter is settled by the terms you both agreed to. I trust we will have no more of this foolishness. Marcus, helped to his feet by his friends, looked across the clearing at Natalie. Something in his expression had changed. The contempt was gone, replaced by a grudging respect mixed with embarrassment. You can shoot, schoolmarm. I'll give you that. And? Dalton's voice was hard. Marcus grimaced. And I was out of line yesterday. What I said was wrong. I apologize. It wasn't gracious, but it was enough. Natalie nodded, not trusting her voice. Marcus and his group mounted up and rode out, leaving the rest of the town milling about uncertainly. Several women approached, among them Mrs. Patterson, who ran the boarding house. That was very brave, dear, she said quietly. Foolish, but brave. Others echoed the sentiment. The town's attitude toward her had shifted somehow in the span of a gunshot. She was no longer just the uptight schoolteacher from back east. She was the woman who'd faced down Marcus Holloway and won. Eventually the crowd dispersed until it was just Natalie and Dalton standing in the clearing as the sun climbed higher. She looked at him, at this man who'd stood beside her when she had no one else, who'd declared himself next in line to defend her honor. Why did you say that? She asked, about being next. Because I meant it. He met her eyes steadily. Because I wanted every man here to know that you're not alone anymore. Because in the past day, I've come to admire you more than just about anyone I've ever met. And I'll be damned if I let you face another threat by yourself. Her breath caught. You barely know me. I know enough. I know you're brave and stubborn and principled. I know you'd rather die than bend. I know that when you set your mind to something, you see it through. He stepped closer. I know that somewhere in the last 18 hours, I started hoping this wouldn't be the only time we stood together. Dalton. His name came out as barely a whisper. I don't know what to say. Don't say anything yet. You've just been through hell. But when you're ready, when your hands stop shaking and the world settles again, maybe you'd let me take you to dinner. Maybe we could see if this feeling I have is something more than just respect and admiration. What feeling? He smiled, soft and genuine. Like I just watched the sunset and the sunrise at the same time. Like something I didn't know was missing just clicked into place. Natalie's heart was doing something complicated in her chest. She'd come to California looking for purpose and found mostly loneliness. In one day, this quiet cowboy had shown her what it might be like to have someone truly see her, value her, stand beside her. "I'd like that," she said. "It's dinner and seeing what this is." His smile widened. "Good, but first let's get you home so you can rest. You've earned it." He helped her onto her horse despite her protests that she was fine, then rode beside her back into Reading. At the general store, he dismounted and helped her down, his hands lingering at her waist for just a moment. "I'll come by tomorrow," he said. "Check on that arm." "It's just a graze. Humor me." She found herself smiling despite everything. "All right." She watched him ride away, then climbed the stairs to her room and collapsed onto her bed. Her arm throbbed, her whole body ached, but she felt oddly light. She'd faced death and survived. More than that, she'd found something unexpected in the process. Someone unexpected. Sleep claimed her quickly, deep and dreamless. When she woke, it was late afternoon. Her arm was stiff and sore but manageable. She changed the bandage carefully, noting that Dr. Chen had done good work. The wound was clean, already beginning to heal. She'd been incredibly lucky. A knock at her door revealed Mrs. Patterson with a tray of food. "I thought you might be hungry, dear. You've had quite a day." "Thank you." Natalie took the tray, surprised by the kindness. "That young man who was with you, Mr. Ingram, he stopped by earlier, left something for you." Mrs. Patterson held out a folded piece of paper. Natalie took it, her pulse quickening. When Mrs. Patterson left, she unfolded the note. Dalton's handwriting was neat and precise. "You were magnificent. Rest well. I'll see you tomorrow. D." She pressed the note to her chest, smiling like a fool. The next days passed in a strange new rhythm. Dalton came by each morning officially to check on her injury, but really just to see her. They'd talk on the porch of the general store, or walk through town together, or ride out to his cabin where he was teaching her to shoot better. The whole town was watching, she knew. But for once she didn't care what they thought. Dalton was different from any man she'd ever known. He listened when she talked about her students, about the books she loved, about her dreams of building a real school building instead of teaching in the church basement. He told her about his ranch work, about growing up in Kansas, about the sister in Denver he still worried about. He was honest and direct and had a dry sense of humor that caught her off guard and made her laugh. 2 weeks after the duel, he took her to dinner at the hotel restaurant, Reading's closest approximation of fine dining. She wore her best dress, dark blue with white lace, and tried not to feel self-conscious about the fading scar on her arm. Dalton wore a clean shirt and vest, his dark hair neatly combed, and looked at her like she was the only person in the room. "I have a question," he said over dessert. "Ask. Do you plan to stay in Reading? I know teaching here wasn't exactly what you dreamed of." Natalie considered. A month ago, she would have said she was counting the days until she could leave. Now, looking across the table at Dalton's gray eyes, she wasn't so sure. "I don't know anymore. Why do you ask?" "Because I'm thinking about buying land, setting up my own ranch instead of working for someone else. I've saved enough to make a start of it, and there's good property available south of here, near the river." He paused. "But it's a big commitment, putting down real roots. I wanted to know if there was a reason to stay beyond just the land." Her heart stuttered. "What kind of reason?" "The kind where I get to see you every day, where we build something together, not just me on my ranch and you in your schoolhouse, but really together." He reached across the table and took her hand. "I'm not good with fancy words, Natalie, but I'm falling in love with you. Actually, I think I might have started falling the moment you walked out of that saloon with your head high and your hands shaking. I've never met anyone like you. I don't want to let you go." Tears pricked her eyes. "I'm falling in love with you too. I've been trying not to, telling myself it's too fast, too soon. But Dalton, when I'm with you, I feel like I can breathe properly for the first time since I came west. Like I'm not fighting the world alone anymore." "You're not alone. Not anymore. Not ever again if you'll have me." "Are you asking me to marry you?" "Not yet." You deserve a proper courtship, not a rushed proposal over pie in a hotel dining room, but I'm asking if I can court you properly. If I can work toward the day when I can ask you to be my wife and you might say yes." She squeezed his hand, smiling through tears. "I'd like that very much." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. "Then we have a plan." The courtship that followed was the happiest time of Natalie's life. Dalton courted her with the same steady determination he brought to everything else. He brought her wildflowers from the hills. He fixed the broken steps at the church where she taught. He sat through her lessons sometimes just to watch her work and told her afterward how good she was with the children. She helped him look at land, riding beside him as they explored different properties, imagining what could be built there. The town's attitude toward them ranged from amused to approving. The story of the duel had become local legend, growing with each retelling. Natalie was no longer the strange Eastern spinster. She was the woman who'd stood her ground, and Dalton was the cowboy who'd stood beside her. Together they made sense to people in a way neither had alone. 3 months after the duel, Dalton bought 200 acres along the Sacramento River, land with good water and grass, perfect for cattle. He started building immediately, and Natalie spent her free time helping however she could, even if it was just bringing him lunch and keeping him company. It was on that land, with the frame of the ranch house rising behind them and the river flowing past, that Dalton formally proposed. It was nothing fancy, just the two of them, and the California sunset. But when he knelt in the dust and asked her to marry him, offering her a simple gold band, it was perfect. "Yes," she said, pulling him to his feet and kissing him. "Yes, absolutely yes." They married in October of 1878, in the same church where she taught. Half of Redding turned out for the wedding, which surprised her. Dr. Chen gave her away, since she had no family in California. Dalton's ranch foreman stood as his best man. It was simple and heartfelt. And when Dalton kissed her as his wife, Natalie felt something settle deep in her soul. This was home. He was home. The ranch became their shared dream. Dalton worked the cattle while Natalie continued teaching, though she cut back her hours to help with the ranch books and correspondence. They worked side by side, building something real and lasting. The first year was hard, all long days and longer nights, learning to navigate marriage while building a business. But they faced it together, and that made all the difference. Natalie discovered that Dalton was a patient husband, thoughtful and considerate. He never tried to change her or dim her fire. Instead, he fanned it, encouraging her to keep teaching even when the ranch work was overwhelming, supporting her dream of building a real school. She discovered in turn that she loved ranch life more than she'd expected, loved the rhythm of seasons and cattle, the satisfaction of watching something grow from nothing. Their first real crisis came in the spring of 1879, when a neighboring rancher tried to claim water rights that belonged to them. The man was aggressive and threatening, the kind who believed might made right. Natalie watched Dalton handle it with the same steady calm he brought to everything, never backing down but never needlessly escalating. When the neighbor showed up drunk and spoiling for a fight, Natalie stepped onto the porch with her rifle and made it clear that anyone who threatened her husband would answer to her first. The neighbor left and didn't come back. The story made its way through the county, adding to their growing legend: the school teacher who could shoot and the cowboy who stood beside her. Together, they were formidable. In the winter of 1880, Natalie realized she was pregnant. The news filled her with joy and terror in equal measure. Dalton was overjoyed, immediately becoming even more protective, trying to prevent her from doing anything strenuous. She had to remind him firmly that pregnancy wasn't an illness and she was perfectly capable of continuing her normal activities. Their son was born in August of 1880, squalling and red-faced and perfect. They named him Samuel, after Dr. Chen, who delivered him and who'd become a good friend. Dalton cried when he held his son for the first time, and Natalie fell even more in love with her husband, watching him cradle their child with such tenderness. Motherhood changed her in ways she hadn't anticipated. She'd always loved children, but loving her own was different, fierce and all-consuming. She took a year away from teaching to focus on Samuel, and Dalton adjusted the ranch work so he could be present more. They figured it out together, learning to be parents the way they'd learned everything else, through trial and error and stubborn determination. When Samuel was 2, Natalie started teaching again part-time, and to her surprise, she found she could balance both roles. Dalton's mother came from Kansas to help, a stern but kind woman who adored her grandson and approved of her daughter-in-law's independence. The ranch was thriving now, earning enough that they could hire more help. Taking some pressure off Dalton, in 1883 their daughter was born. They named her Rose, and she had her mother's dark hair and her father's gray eyes. Samuel was fascinated by his baby sister, wanting to help with everything. Their family felt complete in a way Natalie hadn't known to wish for. The school Natalie had dreamed of became reality in 1884, when the town finally raised funds to build a proper schoolhouse. Natalie was asked to be the head teacher, a position she accepted with pride. Dalton built her a beautiful desk from oak and carved her name into it. She cried when she saw it. The years flowed past, full and rich. The ranch grew into one of the most successful in the county. Samuel grew tall and serious, clearly his father's son. Rose grew spirited and bold with her mother's fire. They had challenges, of course. A harsh winter in 1885 that nearly broke them financially. An outbreak of fever in 1886 that put both children in danger for a terrifying week. The normal struggles of any marriage and family. But through it all, Natalie and Dalton remained partners in the truest sense. They made decisions together, supported each other's dreams, stood beside each other when the world pressed in. The love that had started with a duel and a quiet declaration of solidarity had deepened into something unshakable. In 1890, on a summer evening much like the one where he'd proposed, they stood together watching the sunset from their porch. Samuel, now 10, was helping the ranch hands with evening chores. Rose, 7, was playing with the ranch dogs. The house behind them was full of life and love. "Do you ever regret it?" Dalton asked, his arm around her waist. "Regret what?" "Challenging Marcus that day. If you hadn't, your life would be very different." Natalie leaned into him, thinking about the frightened but determined woman who'd stood in that saloon 12 years ago. "I regret nothing. That moment led to this one, to you, to our family. How could I regret any of it?" "You gave up Boston, a life back east. You could have been teaching at a university by now." "I'm exactly where I want to be." She turned to face him, cupping his weathered face in her hands. "You stood beside me when I had no one. You saw who I really was and loved me for it, not despite it. You built this life with me. I couldn't ask for anything more." He kissed her softly. "I love you, Natalie Ingram." "I love you too," Samuel's voice called from the barn, asking about something. Dalton sighed good-naturedly and went to help. Rose ran up to show Natalie a flower she'd found. The sun continued its descent, painting the California sky in brilliant orange and gold. Natalie thought about destiny, about the strange paths that led people to their right places. If someone had told her years ago that her life would be defined by a single moment of courage in a saloon, that she'd marry a cowboy and become a rancher's wife while still being a teacher, she wouldn't have believed them. But here she was, living a life richer than any she could have imagined. The duel had lasted seconds. The love it sparked had lasted a lifetime. Years continued to pass in the way they do, marking time with growth and change. Samuel grew into a fine young man, serious and hard-working like his father, but with his mother's sharp mind. He took to ranching naturally, but Natalie made sure he got a proper education too, sending him to Sacramento for high school. Rose inherited her mother's passion for teaching and her father's steady determination. She announced at 14 that she wanted to be a doctor, and neither parent discouraged her despite the obstacles she'd face as a woman in medicine. In 1895, when Natalie was 42 and Dalton 45, they celebrated their 17th wedding anniversary by returning to Miller's Creek where the duel had taken place. The clearing looked different now, more trees grown up, the grass different. But the memory was crystal clear. I was so scared that morning, Natalie admitted, standing where she'd stood with a gun in her trembling hand. I know, I was scared for you. But you believed I could do it. I believed you'd try, and that was enough. Dalton pulled her close. You taught me something that day, Natalie. You taught me that courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about being terrified and doing it anyway. You taught me something too. That I didn't have to face everything alone. That letting someone stand beside me wasn't weakness. It was strength. They stood together in the clearing as afternoon light filtered through the trees. Two people who'd built a life on the foundation of mutual respect and love. The years had weathered them both, put lines on their faces and silver in their hair, but the connection between them had only grown stronger. Marcus Holloway had left Reading years ago, moving somewhere north, his reputation never quite recovering from being shot by a schoolteacher. Natalie occasionally wondered what became of him but didn't dwell on it. He'd been a catalyst, nothing more. The real story had always been about what came after. In 1898, Samuel married a rancher's daughter from the next county, a bright young woman named Elizabeth who reminded Natalie of herself at that age. The wedding was large and joyful, held at the ranch with half the county attending. Watching her son dance with his bride, Natalie felt the bittersweet pang of time passing, of children growing and lives changing. Rose left for medical school in San Francisco that same year, one of only a handful of women accepted to the program. Natalie cried with pride when she saw her daughter off, remembering the little girl who'd chased dogs around the ranch yard. Dalton was stoic about it, but she found him in their daughter's empty room that night, sitting on the bed and looking lost. She'll come back, Natalie said gently. I know. But she won't be ours the same way again. She's her own person now, with her own life ahead of her. We raised her to be independent and strong. We did our job well. He pulled her down beside him. I suppose we did. Doesn't make it easier. No, it doesn't. They navigated the empty nest together, finding new rhythms in their days. The ranch still demanded attention, and Natalie still taught, though she'd cut back her hours. They had more time for each other now. Long rides through their land, quiet evenings on the porch, trips to Sacramento to visit Rose. Samuel and Elizabeth gave them their first grandchild in 1899, a little girl they named Natalie after her grandmother. Holding her tiny namesake, Natalie felt the circle complete somehow. This child would grow up knowing the story of her grandmother's duel, the cowboy who stood beside her, the life they built together. The story would become family legend passed down through generations. In 1900, as the new century dawned, they threw a party at the ranch. Samuel and Elizabeth were there with baby Natalie. Rose came home from medical school, bringing stories of her studies and the challenges she faced as a woman in a male-dominated field. Friends from all over the county attended. It was a celebration not just of the new century, but of everything they'd built. Late in the evening, when most guests had left and the family was sitting around the fireplace, Rose asked the question she'd asked 100 times as a child. Tell us about the duel again. Natalie and Dalton exchanged glances, smiling. Samuel groaned good-naturedly. Rose, we've heard this story 1,000 times. And you'll hear it 1,000 more, Rose said. It's a good story. It is a good story, Elizabeth agreed, bouncing baby Natalie on her knee. I want to hear it too. So Dalton told it, the way he always did, with Natalie adding details and corrections. The story of a schoolteacher who stood up for herself, a cowboy who stood beside her, and a love that grew from that moment of shared courage. Rose and Samuel had heard it countless times, but they listened as if it were new, because it was their origin story as much as their parents'. When the story ended, Rose said thoughtfully, You changed everything that day, Mama, for yourself, but also for other women. You showed them they didn't have to accept being treated poorly. I just did what needed doing, Natalie said. That's what courage is, Dalton said, squeezing her hand. Doing what needs doing even when you're terrified. Later that night, after everyone had gone to bed, Natalie and Dalton sat on their porch looking at the stars. The ranch was quiet around them, full of the life they'd built. 22 years since they'd married, over 20 years since that fateful day in the saloon. "Any regrets?" Dalton asked, echoing his question from years ago. "Not a single one. You?" "Only that I didn't walk up to you sooner that day. I'd seen you around town before, always admired you from a distance. Maybe if I'd had the courage to introduce myself properly, you wouldn't have needed to challenge Marcus at all." Natalie laughed. "But then we wouldn't have our story." "True enough." He pulled her close, kissing the top of her head. "I love you, Natalie. After all these years, I love you more every single day." "I love you too, Dalton, my partner, my champion, my everything." They sat together under the California stars, two people who'd found each other in the most unlikely of circumstances and built something beautiful from it. The duel was long past, but its legacy lived on in the life they shared, the family they'd raised, the love that had started with 5 words, "I'm next." And as they sat there, Natalie thought about the young woman who'd walked into a saloon all those years ago, alone and angry and desperate to be respected. That woman had been brave, but she'd also been lonely, fighting every battle by herself because she thought that's what strength meant. She understood now that real strength wasn't about standing alone. It was about knowing when to accept help, when to let someone stand beside you, when to build something together that neither of you could build alone. Dalton had taught her that, showing up in her life at exactly the right moment and refusing to let her face the world by herself. The years ahead would bring more changes, more challenges. Rose would finish medical school and open a practice. Samuel would take over more of the ranch operations as Dalton slowed down. There would be more grandchildren, more celebrations, more quiet evenings like this one, and eventually, as with all lives, there would be loss and grief. But they would face it all together, the way they'd faced everything since that August morning in 1878. For now, though, there was just this moment. The stars overhead, the land around them, the man beside her who'd seen her courage and matched it with his own. The cowboy who'd stood beside her and declared himself next, who'd loved her with a steadiness that never wavered, who'd built this beautiful, full life with her piece by piece. Natalie had come west looking for purpose and found more than she'd ever dreamed. She'd found herself, her strength, her calling. But most of all, she'd found Dalton, and in finding him, she'd found home. The wind whispered through the California hills, carrying the scent of grass and water and summer. Inside the house, her grandchild slept peacefully. Her children, grown and strong, were building their own lives with courage she'd helped instill. And beside her, warm and solid and constant, was the man who'd changed everything by simply standing beside her and refusing to let her fight alone. It was more than enough. It was everything. Years flowed into decades. In 1905, Rose returned to Redding with her medical degree and opened a practice, becoming the first female doctor in the county. The challenges she faced were significant, but she handled them with her mother's fire and her father's steadiness, and eventually won over even the most skeptical patients. She never married, dedicating herself entirely to her practice, and Natalie understood that completely. Some people found their purpose in partnership, others in their work. Both were valid paths. Samuel expanded the ranch, buying adjacent property and building the operation into something substantial that would provide for generations. He and Elizabeth had 4 children total, filling the ranch with noise and life. Natalie and Dalton's grandchildren grew up riding horses and learning to read, getting education and practical skills in equal measure. In 1910, Dalton fell ill with pneumonia. For 2 terrifying weeks, Natalie sat by his bedside, Rose using all her medical knowledge to fight for her father's life. Dalton pulled through, but it left him weaker, forcing him to step back from active ranch work. He was 60 by then, and the years of hard labor had taken their toll. Samuel took over primary management of the ranch, with Dalton advising. Natalie retired from teaching that same year, her body telling her it was time. She'd taught 3 generations of Redding children by then, leaving an impact that would ripple through the community for years. The school board held a celebration in her honor, and she was genuinely touched by the outpouring of affection. The frightened Eastern school teacher who'd arrived in 1875 had become a beloved community pillar. Retirement gave Natalie and Dalton time they'd never had before. They spent their days on the porch watching their grandchildren play, taking slow walks through the ranch land, talking about everything and nothing. The pace had slowed, but the love hadn't diminished. If anything, it had deepened, burnished by decades of partnership and shared life. In 1915, Redding held a celebration for the town's 50th anniversary. As part of the festivities, they asked older residents to share their stories. Natalie and Dalton were among those interviewed, and the story of the duel was recorded for the first time in the town's official history. Sitting together and recounting those events from 37 years earlier felt surreal, like talking about different people. "Do you think you'd do it again?" the young historian asked Natalie. "Challenge him to a duel?" Natalie considered carefully. "I'd like to think I'd find a smarter way to handle it, but if pushed to that same wall with no other options, yes, I'd do it again. Some things are worth fighting for, and self-respect is one of them." "And you, Mr. Ingram, would you stand beside her again?" Dalton didn't hesitate. "Every single time, I'd always choose to stand beside her." They held hands during the interview, old hands now, marked by age and work, but their grips were still strong. The historian smiled, clearly charmed by the elderly couple and their enduring love story. In 1918, the world was at war, though it seemed far away from their California ranch. Samuel's oldest son enlisted despite the family's concerns, wanting to do his part. Those months while he was overseas were agonizing, but he returned safely in 1919, bringing with him a French bride and stories of a world much changed. The 1920s brought prosperity and change. Automobiles became common, the ranch modernized, Rose's medical practice thrived, the grandchildren grew and started families of their own. Natalie and Dalton, now in their 70s, watched it all with wonder, amazed at how much the world had transformed since their youth. On their 50th wedding anniversary in 1928, the family threw an enormous celebration. 3 generations gathered at the ranch to honor the couple who'd started it all. There were 50 people present, all family or close friends, all connected to Natalie and Dalton's story in some way. Samuel gave a toast that made Natalie cry. "My parents taught me that love isn't just a feeling. It's a choice you make every single day. It's standing beside someone when things are hard, believing in them when they doubt themselves, building something together that's stronger than what either of you could build alone. They've lived that example for 50 years, and every one of us here is better for it." Dalton stood, his voice still strong despite his years. 50 years ago, I married the bravest woman I ever met. She walked into danger with her head high, and I knew I wanted to spend my life beside her. These 50 years have been the greatest gift. Natalie, you've made every day an adventure. I love you more now than I did when we started, and I'll love you until my last breath. Natalie couldn't speak past the lump in her throat. She just held his hand and nodded, hoping he could see in her eyes everything she felt. The party went late into the night, full of music and dancing and laughter. Natalie and Dalton danced together, slow and careful now, but still moving in perfect harmony. Around them, their family celebrated the legacy of that duel and the love it sparked spreading through generations. As the decade turned, age began to catch up with them both in earnest. Dalton's lungs never fully recovered from the pneumonia, and he tired easily. Natalie's joints ached with arthritis. They needed help with daily tasks they'd once done without thinking. But they faced aging the way they'd faced everything, together and without complaint. In 1932, Dalton's health took a serious decline. Rose did everything she could, but they all knew the truth. He was 82 and his body was simply wearing out. He spent his final weeks in the bedroom they'd shared for over 50 years, surrounded by family, with Natalie at his side constantly. "I don't want to leave you," he said one afternoon when it was just the two of them. "I know," Natalie said, tears streaming down her face. "But Dalton, what a life we've had. What a beautiful, full life." "No regrets?" "Not a single one. You?" He smiled, the same smile that had captured her heart all those years ago. "Only that I want more time. I'd take 100 more years with you if I could." "We've had 54 years. That's more than most people get. We've loved deeply and been loved in return. We've raised children who are good people. We've built something that will last long after we're gone." She held his hand gently. "It's enough, my love. It has to be enough." "Promise me something," he said, "anything." "Promise me you'll keep living. Really living, not just existing. You've got more years ahead, and I want you to fill them with joy, not just grief." "Dalton, promise me, Natalie." "I promise," she whispered. He died 3 days later, peacefully in his sleep with Natalie beside him holding his hand. The funeral was enormous, the whole county turning out to honor the man who'd been a pillar of the community for over 50 years. But to Natalie, all those people were just background noise. The man she loved, her partner of over half a century, was gone, and the world felt impossibly empty. The months after were the hardest of her life. She'd faced danger and challenges and hardship, but she'd always faced them with Dalton beside her. Now she was alone in a way she hadn't been since that day in the saloon, and it was devastating. Her children and grandchildren surrounded her with love, but there was a Dalton-shaped hole in her life that nothing could fill. Slowly, painfully, she learned to navigate widowhood. She kept her promise to him, choosing to live rather than just exist. She spent time with her grandchildren and great-grandchildren, passing on stories of their grandfather. She helped Rose at the medical practice. She took up painting, something she'd always wanted to try. She lived because he'd asked her to. On what would have been their 58th wedding anniversary, Natalie returned to Miller's Creek alone. She stood in the clearing where everything had begun, remembering the terrified young woman she'd been and the steady cowboy who'd offered to teach her to shoot. The memories were bittersweet, but precious. "I kept my promise," she said to the empty air, to Dalton's memory. "I'm living. But God, I miss you." The wind whispered through the trees, and for just a moment Natalie could almost feel him there beside her, almost hear him saying what he'd said so many times over their years together. "You're not alone. Not ever." She lived 4 more years, full years enriched by family and purpose. She saw Rose's practice expand and Samuel's ranch prosper. She met great-great-grandchildren, tiny babies who would grow up hearing stories of their remarkable ancestors. She finished a book of memoirs that she'd been writing, preserving their story for future generations. In the spring of 1936, at the age of 83, Natalie Vernon Ingram passed away in her sleep. She was buried beside Dalton on a hill overlooking the ranch they'd built together, under the California sky they'd loved. Their headstone was simple: together in life, together in eternity. The legacy they left was profound. Their children and grandchildren carried forward their values of courage, partnership, and love. The ranch prospered for generations. Rose's medical practice became a family tradition, with her nieces and nephews following her into medicine. The story of the Duel and the cowboy who stood beside her became family legend, told and retold until it took on mythic proportions. But the real story wasn't the duel. It was what came after. 2 people who found each other in an unlikely moment and chose, every day for over 50 years, to stand beside each other. Who built a life based on mutual respect and unwavering support. Who showed that true love isn't just romance and passion, though they had both, but partnership and choice and determination to face whatever comes together. In Reading, the story was never forgotten. The schoolhouse where Natalie taught was preserved and eventually became a museum. Miller's Creek, where the duel took place, was marked with a historical plaque, but the real monument to their love was the family they created. Generations of people who understood that courage means standing up for yourself and standing beside those you love, who knew that the greatest adventures are built not in moments of grand gesture, but in daily choices to support and cherish and believe in your partner. The duel lasted seconds. The Cowboys' declaration, "I'm next," took only a moment. Yeah. But the love they built on that foundation lasted a lifetime and beyond, rippling forward through time, touching lives decades and generations after they were gone. In the end, that was the true story worth telling. Not just the dramatic moment of a woman challenging a man and a cowboy standing beside her, but the beautiful, ordinary, extraordinary life they built together afterward, day by day, year by year, until death itself couldn't diminish what they'd created. And somewhere perhaps in whatever comes after, two souls stood together still, watching their legacy unfold hand in hand as they'd always been, together in life, together in eternity, just as their headstone promised. The school teacher and the cowboy, forever.